You have been told that inequality is an accident, a flaw, a temporal imbalance that time, patience, or hard work will eventually correct. This is the first and greatest deception. Inequality is not a mistake in this society, it is its daily achievement. It is produced with the same regularity as profit, enforced with the same discipline as labor, and defended with the same institutions that call themselves neutral, natural, and eternal. Look closely at the ordinary rhythm of life under capitalism. At dawn, millions rise not because they are fulfilled, but because survival commands them. They sell their labor not as free individuals, but as commodities, priced, measured, and exhausted. In the same hours, capital sleeps peacefully, already growing, already expanding, already claiming tomorrow's wealth before it has been created. This is not coincidence. This is the structure of power revealing itself in routine form. Inequality reproduces itself first through ownership. A small class owns the means by which all must live: the factories, the land, the machines, the platforms, the resources. The vast majority owns nothing but its capacity to work. From this single division flows an entire world of domination. Those who own command, those who do not obey, those who possess accumulate, those who labor merely subsist. Every day this separation is renewed, not by force alone, but by law, contract, and habit. The worker is told that wages are fair, that the contract is voluntary, that exploitation is a harsh word for a neutral exchange. Yet, what is exchange? Living labor, creative energy, time that can never be recovered, for a wage that barely reproduces the worker's existence. The surplus, the true wealth created by collective labor, is seized by the owner, not because of merit, but because of ownership. Thus inequality is reborn with every shift, every transaction, every unpaid hour hidden inside the working day. This system does not merely exploit, it educates. From childhood, people are trained to accept hierarchy as nature. Competition is praised as virtue, obedience as responsibility, failure as personal guilt. The poor are told they lack discipline. The unemployed are told they lack effort. The exploited are told they lack skill. In this way, inequality reproduces itself inside the mind before it ever appears in the paycheck. Consciousness itself becomes a terrain of class struggle. The state, which claims to stand above society, in truth stands firmly upon its foundation. It protects property before people, order before justice, stability before liberation. Its laws sanctify inequality. Its police enforce it. Its courts rationalize it. When workers resist, they are called disruptive. When capital devastates lives, it is called necessary. Thus, domination is daily renewed under the mask of legality. Even progress is captured and turned against the many. Technology, which could shorten labor and expand freedom, is instead used to intensify work and concentrate wealth. Productivity rises, yet insecurity deepens. The worker produces more than ever and receives less relative to what is created. Inequality does not stagnate, it advances, refined by innovation, sharpened by efficiency, justified by numbers. But this system has a fatal contradiction. It depends entirely on the labor it degrades. Capital is dead labor that lives only by sucking living labor, and the more it sucks, the more it reveals its parasitic nature. The working class is not merely a victim of history, it is its driving force. In its collective labor lies the power to dismantle the very relations that oppress it. Inequality persists because workers are divided by nation, race, gender, belief, and fear. These divisions are not accidental, they are cultivated. A divided class cannot recognize itself as a class. An isolated worker blames themselves. An organized worker recognizes the system. The ruling class knows this truth well, which is why it invests so heavily in fragmentation and distraction. The task before us is not charity, not reform at the margins, not the polite adjustment of exploitation. It is the transformation of the social relations that reproduce inequality every single day. This requires consciousness, organization, and solidarity. It requires workers to see their shared condition, to reject the lies of individual escape, and to act as a collective force. History is not moved by goodwill, it is moved by struggle. Every right ever won was taken, not granted. The future will not be handed down from above, it must be built from below. Inequality will not fade on its own. It must be confronted, exposed, and abolished at its roots. Workers of the world, the truth is already written in your lives. You create everything, yet own nothing. You sustain society, yet are denied its fruits. Recognize your power, organize your strength, and reclaim the world that your labor has built. The reproduction of inequality is daily, but so is the reproduction of resistance. The question is not whether change is possible, but whether the oppressed will finally act as the force history has made them. Inequality is not accidental. It is structurally produced and renewed daily by capitalism, woven into the ordinary functioning of society so deeply that it appears natural, inevitable, and beyond challenge. Capitalism does not merely tolerate inequality as a side effect of growth or inefficiency, it requires inequality in order to function. From the moment production is organized around private ownership of the means of production, society is divided into those who own and those who must sell their labor to survive. This division is not temporary or incidental. It is the foundation upon which the entire system rests, and it must be continuously reproduced for capital to accumulate. Each day, workers enter factories, offices, fields, warehouses, and digital platforms not as free participants in social production, but as commodities themselves. Their labor power is bought for a wage that represents only a fraction of the value they create. The difference between what workers produce and what they are paid is surplus value, appropriated by the owning class. This extraction is not an act of theft carried out in secret. It is legalized, normalized, and celebrated as profit. Through this mechanism alone, inequality is recreated every single working day, as wealth flows upward while precarity flows downward. Capitalism ensures that this process appears fair by disguising exploitation as exchange. The wage contract is presented as an agreement between equals, even though one side controls access to work, resources, and survival itself. The worker is free, only in the sense that they are free to choose which capitalist they will serve or free to starve. This coercion is structural, not personal, and it guarantees that inequality does not require constant physical force to maintain itself. Economic necessity disciplines the working class more effectively than chains ever could. Beyond the workplace, inequality is reproduced through institutions that claim neutrality. Education systems reward those who already possess cultural and economic capital, while labeling others as failures. Housing markets segregate populations by income and class, turning shelter into an instrument of accumulation. Healthcare becomes a privilege rather than a right, ensuring that poverty shortens lives while wealth extends them. These outcomes are not malfunctions of the system. They are predictable results of organizing human needs around profit rather than collective well-being. Ideology plays a crucial role in this daily reproduction. Capitalism teaches individuals to interpret structural oppression as personal deficiency. If one is poor, it is said to be due to laziness if one is unemployed, due to lack of skill if one is exhausted, due to poor choices. In this way, inequality is internalized as guilt, shame rather than recognized as a social relation. The working class is encouraged to compete against itself, to aspire to individual escape instead of collective transformation, ensuring that systemic inequality persists without unified resistance. The state reinforces this arrangement while presenting itself as an impartial arbiter. Laws protecting private property are enforced with uncompromising violence, while laws protecting labor are weakened, delayed, or ignored. When workers organize, they are met with repression, When capital exploits, it is met with incentives. Public resources are redirected to bail out corporations, subsidize industry, and stabilize markets, while social spending is framed as a burden. Through taxation, debt, and austerity, the state transfers wealth upward, renewing inequality under the banner of fiscal responsibility. Even moments of crisis serve to deepen inequality rather than disrupt it. Economic collapses, pandemics, and environmental disasters disproportionately devastate the working class while creating new opportunities for accumulation at the top. Jobs are lost, wages stagnate, and social protections are dismantled, while capital consolidates, acquires distressed assets, and expands its power. Crisis does not threaten capitalism as hierarchy, it sharpens it, proving once again that inequality is not a failure of the system, but one of its most reliable products. Technological advancement, often hailed as a force for liberation, is likewise absorbed into this logic. Machines increase productivity, but the benefits are not shared. Instead of reducing labor time and expanding freedom, technology is used to intensify work, monitor workers, and eliminate jobs while profits soar. The worker becomes more replaceable, more precarious, and more dependent, while capital becomes more concentrated and more powerful, reinforcing inequality under the appearance of progress. This constant reproduction of inequality depends on fragmentation. Differences of nationality, race, gender, and culture are exploited to prevent the working class from recognizing its shared condition. These divisions are encouraged not to eliminate oppression, but to manage it, ensuring that anger is directed sideways instead of upward. As long as workers see themselves as isolated individuals rather than a collective force, inequality continues its daily renewal, embedded in production, law, ideology, and habit, sustained by a system that cannot exist without it, and therefore reproduce it endlessly through the ordinary acts of working, consuming, obeying, and surviving. Ownership of the means of production is the root of class domination because it determines who controls labor, resources, and the conditions of life itself. In any society where the tools, land, factories, and technologies necessary for production are held by a minority, that minority gains power not through personal virtue or intelligence, but through structural position. Those who own decide what is produced, how it is produced, and who is allowed to participate. Those who do not own are compelled to submit their labor in order to survive. From this unequal relation flows the entire hierarchy of class society. Under capitalism, the separation of workers from the means of production is not a historical accident, but a deliberate and ongoing process. Through enclosure, privatization, and the legal sanctification of property, the masses are stripped of independent access to land and tools. Once dispossessed, they are forced into wage labor, selling their labor power to those who own what they need in order to work. This dependency is the material foundation of domination, as it places the worker in a permanent position of vulnerability, negotiating survival with those who control employment. The power of ownership extends far beyond the workplace. Because the capitalist class controls production, it also controls distribution. It decides which needs are worth satisfying and which lives are worth investing in. Entire communities are abandoned when they cease to be profitable, while others are exploited until their labor and resources are exhausted. This is not the result of malice, but of a system that subordinates human life to accumulation. Ownership grants the authority to prioritize profit over people, and this authority is the essence of class power. Domination is maintained not primarily through open violence, but through the quiet coercion of necessity. The worker appears free, yet this freedom is purely formal. They are free to choose among employers, free to accept or reject wages that cannot be refused without risking hunger, homelessness, or social exclusion. Ownership transforms economic power into social command, allowing the capitalist to rule without appearing to gun, to dominate without issuing direct orders beyond the workplace. This relation shapes consciousness itself. Those who own come to see their position as natural and deserved, while those who do not are taught to see their condition as temporary or self-inflicted. Ownership confers not only material wealth but ideological authority. The values of the owning class are presented as universal values, its interests as society, as interests, its dominance as common sense. Through education, media, and culture, the logic of ownership is normalized, and domination becomes invisible. The state functions as the guardian of this arrangement. Its primary role is not to represent the collective will, but to protect the property relations upon which class power rests. Laws defend ownership with relentless precision, while the needs of the dispossessed are treated as secondary or conditional. When property is threatened, the full force of the state is deployed. When lives are threatened by poverty or exploitation, assistance is debated, delayed, or denied. This asymmetry reveals the true foundation of political power in a society structured around ownership. Even advancements that appear to weaken domination often strengthen it. As production becomes more centralized and technologically advanced, ownership becomes more concentrated. Fewer individuals and corporations control greater portions of social wealth, while workers become increasingly interchangeable. The more productive society becomes, the less control workers have over their labor and its products. Ownership thus transforms collective progress into private power, deepening class domination under the guise of efficiency and growth. Class domination persists because ownership is inherited, accumulated, and defended across generations. Those born into ownership begin life with security, opportunity, and influence, while those born without it inherit insecurity and constraint. This reproduction of class relations ensures that inequality is not merely economic but historical, passing domination from parent to child as reliably as property itself. The promise of social mobility serves to mask this reality, offering exceptional cases as proof of fairness while the structure remains intact. To challenge class domination, one must confront its root. As long as the means of production remain privately owned, exploitation and hierarchy will reappear in new forms. Redistribution without transformation leaves ownership untouched, and therefore leaves power unchanged. True liberation requires the socialization of the means by which society produces its life, allowing workers to collectively control their labor and its fruits. Only when ownership is transformed can domination be dismantled, because the power to command labor, appropriate, surplus, and shape society flows directly from ownership itself, anchoring class rule in the material. Organization of production exploitation persists through surplus value extracted from collective labor, because the wealth of society is created collectively, while its rewards are privately appropriated. Every commodity, every service, every technological advancement is the result of many hands, many minds, and accumulated social knowledge, yet capitalism treats this collective creation as the property of a few. Workers come together in production not as isolated individuals but as an interconnected force, each role dependent on the others. Yet the value produced by this corporation does not return to those who generate it. Instead, it is captured by those who own the means of production, turning collective effort into private gain. Surplus value arises from the difference between the value workers create and the value they receive in wages. The working day is divided invisibly into two parts. In one part, workers reproduce the value of their own wages, covering the cost of their survival. In the remaining hours, they continue to work, creating value for which they are not paid. This unpaid labor is the source of profit, interest, and rent. It is not accidental or exceptional. It is the normal functioning of capitalism, repeated every day in every workplace, regardless of industry or nation. The collective nature of labor is essential to this process. No single worker produces wealth alone. Production is social, coordinated, and interdependent, yet the products of this cooperation confront workers as alien forces owned and controlled by capital. The more workers cooperate, the more productive they become, and the greater the surplus value extracted from them. What appears as progress in efficiency is, under capitalism, an expansion of exploitation, and increased productivity allows more value to be extracted in the same or even shorter time. Capitalism conceals this exploitation by focusing attention on wages rather than value. Workers are encouraged to negotiate pay, compete for raises, and compare incomes, while the fundamental question of how much value they collectively produce is obscured. As long as wages are paid, exploitation is denied. Yet the existence of profit itself proves exploitation. Because profit can only come from unpaid labor. Machines do not create value, capital does not create value, only living labor does. And surplus value is the portion of that labor seized without equivalent return. The organization of work intensifies this extraction. Through specialization, supervision, and technological control, capital maximizes output while minimizing resistance. Workers are fragmented into roles that obscure the collective nature of their labor, making it harder to see how surplus value is produced and where it goes. The assembly line, the office hierarchy, and the digital platform all serve the same function, to coordinate collective labor while preventing collective power. Exploitation persists not because workers are unproductive, but because they are too productive for a system that rewards ownership instead of labor. Ideology reinforces this arrangement by portraying profit as a reward for risk, innovation, or leadership. The capitalist is depicted as the creator of wealth, while workers are framed as beneficiaries of employment rather than producers of value. This inversion hides the reality that capital depends entirely on labor, not the other way around. Without workers, factories are silent, offices are empty, and platforms are inert. Yet the narrative of entrepreneurship masks exploitation by personalizing what is in fact a structural relation. The state stabilizes surplus value extraction by enforcing contracts, protecting property, and disciplining labor. Laws regulate strikes, limit organizing, and prioritize the uninterrupted flow of production. When workers resist exploitation, they are accused of disrupting the economy, as if the economy was something separate from their labor. In truth, the economy is nothing but organized labor under conditions of ownership that allows surplus value to be siphoned upward with legal and political support. Crises reveal this mechanism with particular clarity. When profits fall, wages are cut, jobs are eliminated, and working conditions deteriorate, while the demand for productivity increases. Workers are asked to sacrifice in order to save the system that exploits them. The burden of adjustment always falls on labor, never on surplus value itself. This demonstrates that exploitation is not a moral failure of individuals, but a structural necessity of capitalism, which must preserve surplus value extraction even at the cost of social suffering. The persistence of exploitation depends on workers being separated from the full product of their collective labor and from control over the conditions of production. As long as labor remains collective while ownership remains private, surplus value will continue to be extracted, accumulated, and concentrated. The solution does not lie in better wages alone, but in transforming the relations of production so that collective labor is matched by collective ownership and democratic control, ending the systematic appropriation of surplus value that defines exploitation. Under capitalism, the state and ideology function to legitimize and protect inequality by presenting historically specific relations of domination as universal, natural, and necessary. The state claims to stand above society as a neutral arbiter of competing interests, yet in reality it emerges from and serves the material conditions of the dominant class. Its laws, institutions, and coercive apparatus are shaped to preserve existing property relations, ensuring that the unequal distribution of wealth and power appears lawful, orderly, and justified rather than imposed and exploitative. Through law, inequality is transformed from a social relation into a legal fact. Private ownership of the means of production is treated as sacred, while access to basic necessities is conditional. Contracts between worker and employer are enforced as agreements between equals. Even though one side owns capital and the other owns only labor power. When property is threatened, the state responds decisively. When workers' lives are threatened by poverty, insecurity, or exhaustion, intervention is cautious, limited, or absent. This selective protection reveals whose interests the state ultimately serves, despite its rhetoric of universality. The coercive power of the state reinforces this legitimacy. Police, courts, and prisons exist ostensibly to maintain order, yet the order they defend is one structured by inequality. Acts that challenge property relations are criminalized, while acts that reproduce exploitation are normalized. Strikes are restricted, protests are regulated, and resistance is labeled disorder, while mass layoffs, wage theft, and environmental destruction are treated as economic decisions. Violence is hidden within legality, making domination appear peaceful and consensual. Ideology complements this coercion by shaping how people understand their position within society. It teaches that inequality is the result of effort, talent, or fate rather than structure. Success is portrayed as proof of virtue, failure as evidence of personal deficiency. In this way, systemic exploitation is internalized as individual responsibility. Workers are encouraged to compete with one another rather than recognize their shared condition, fragmenting collective awareness and neutralizing resistance before it can take form. Education systems play a crucial role in this ideological reproduction. They claim to offer equal opportunity while rewarding those who already possess economic and cultural advantages. Discipline, punctuality, and obedience are cultivated as virtues, preparing students for their future roles within hierarchical workplaces. Critical examination of power is discouraged or abstracted, while the existing social order is presented as the end point of historical development. Thus, inequality is reproduced not only materially, but intellectually, generation after generation. Media and culture further entrench this logic. The lives of the wealthy are celebrated as aspirational, while the struggles of the poor are sensationalized or ignored. Structural causes of suffering are replaced with stories of personal triumph or failure, reinforcing the illusion that anyone can rise if they try hard enough. Consumption is promoted as freedom, masking the fact that most people can only consume what their wages allow. Ideology turns domination into desire, making inequality appear not only tolerable but motivating. Even reforms that appear to challenge inequality often serve to stabilize it. Limited welfare provisions, symbolic representation, and controlled participation give the impression of responsiveness while leaving underlying power relations intact. By managing discontent rather than eliminating its causes, the state maintains legitimacy without surrendering control. Inequality is softened at the edges, not dismantled at the core, ensuring that the system survives its own contradictions. The state also mediates class conflict in ways that favor capital. Labor laws are framed as protections, yet they often function to regulate and contain struggle rather than empower workers. Collective bargaining is permitted only within narrow limits. Strikes are constrained by legal procedures, and radical challenges to ownership are excluded entirely. Through this management, resistance is absorbed into institutional channels that neutralize its transformative potential. Ideology's greatest achievement is making inequality appear inevitable. By presenting capitalism as natural and eternal, alternatives are dismissed as unrealistic or dangerous. History is rewritten as a series of improvements leading to the present order, obscuring the struggles and violence that produced it. When inequality is seen as unavoidable, resistance appears futile, and acceptance becomes rational. Together, the state and ideology form a mutually reinforcing system. The state enforces material relations of inequality, while ideology explains and justifies them. One disciplines bodies, the other disciplines minds. Neither could function as effectively without the other, and both rely on the daily reproduction of social relations that privilege ownership, authority, and accumulation. Inequality persists not simply because of economic mechanisms, but because it is continually validated, defended, and normalized by institutions that present domination as order, exploitation as necessity, and hierarchy as common sense, ensuring that power remains concentrated while appearing legitimate and uncontested. Class consciousness and organized worker unity are essential for revolutionary change, because exploitation persists not through ignorance alone, but through fragmentation. Capitalism does not rule solely by force or ideology. It rules by keeping workers separate from one another, isolated in their workplaces, identities, and daily struggles. As long as individuals experience exploitation as a private misfortune rather than a collective condition, the system remains secure. Class consciousness emerges when workers recognize that their suffering is not personal failure but a shared structural reality rooted in the relations of production. Without class consciousness, inequality appears random, temporary, or deserved. Workers may feel anger, exhaustion, or resentment, yet lack the framework to understand its source. This confusion benefits the ruling class, as discontent is redirected toward scapegoats, rival workers, or abstract enemies rather than the system itself. Class consciousness cuts through this fog by revealing the common position workers occupy regardless of occupation, culture, or nationality. It transforms scattered grievances into a coherent understanding of exploitation as a social relation between classes. This awareness does not arise spontaneously or automatically. It develops through struggle, education, and shared experience. In the act of resisting exploitation, workers begin to see their collective power. Strikes, organizing efforts, and mutual aid expose the fact that production depends entirely on labor acting together. When workers withdraw their labor collectively, the illusion of capital's independence collapses. Factories stop, services halt, and profits vanish, demonstrating that the true force sustaining society is not ownership but labor in motion. Organized unity gives class consciousness material form. Awareness without organization remains abstract, vulnerable to repression and co-optation. Organization allows workers to coordinate action, defend gains, and sustain resistance over time. Through unions, councils, assemblies, and other collective structures, workers move from reactive protest to deliberate struggle. Unity turns individual vulnerability into collective strength, replacing fear with solidarity and isolation with shared purpose. Capitalism actively works to prevent this unity. It divides workers by skill level, employment status, race, gender, and nationality, creating artificial hierarchies within the working class. These divisions are reinforced through wage differentials, legal distinction, and cultural narratives that assign value to some labor while degrading others. Class consciousness challenges these divisions by emphasizing shared exploitation over imposed difference, recognizing that all workers are subordinated to the same system of ownership and surplus extraction. The ruling class understands the danger of worker unity, which is why it invests so heavily in suppressing it. Labor organizing is regulated, surveilled, and criminalized, while corporate organization is protected and encouraged. Media portrays collective action as irresponsible or outdated, while individual success is celebrated as the highest aspiration. Ideology frames solidarity as weakness and competition as strength, obscuring the fact that competition among workers only strengthens capital's position. Revolutionary change requires moving beyond defensive struggles toward a collective vision of social transformation. Class consciousness expands from recognizing exploitation to questioning the legitimacy of the system that produces it. Workers begin to see that reforms within capitalism may alleviate suffering temporarily, but cannot eliminate domination rooted in private ownership of the means of production. Unity enables workers to imagine and fight for a society organized around collective ownership, democratic control, and production for need rather than profit. Historical change has never been driven by isolated individuals, but by organized masses acting with shared purpose. Every advance in workers' rights was won through collective struggle, often against fierce resistance. These victories were not gifts from the state or the benevolence of capital, but the result of unity forged in conflict. Class consciousness turns history from something that happens to people into something they actively shape. As organization deepens, workers cease to see themselves merely as victims demanding concessions and begin to act as a class capable of exercising power. They recognize that their labor already sustains society and that they possess the capacity to reorganize production on new foundations. This recognition undermines the ideological authority of the ruling class and exposes its dependence on continued submission from below. Revolutionary change does not begin with slogans or declarations, but with the slow, difficult process of building trust, solidarity, and shared understanding among the exploited. Class consciousness grows through collective action, and collective action strengthens consciousness in return. Together, they form the basis for a movement capable of confronting capital, not as individuals seeking relief, but as a unified class seeking transformation, aware of its power, rooted in its shared condition, and prepared to reshape society through organized struggle grounded in the reality of collective labor and common interest. Inequality endures not because it is invincible, but because it is continuously produced, defended, and disguised as the natural order of things. Capitalism reproduces domination each day through ownership, exploitation, law, and ideology, turning collective labor into private power and human need into a source of profit. Yet within this same process lies its undoing. The system that concentrates wealth also concentrates workers. The system that exploits labor also reveals labor as the true source of all value. When workers recognize themselves as a class, when they organize beyond imposed divisions, when they refuse to accept exploitation as fate, the foundations of inequality begin to fracture. History is not written by capital alone, but by struggle, and every social order carries within it the forces that will transform it. The task before the oppressed is not to appeal to the conscience of their rulers, but to claim their collective power, dismantle the relations that sustain domination, and build a society in which production serves human life rather than profit, where equality is not promised, but materially realized through collective ownership, democratic control, and conscious solidarity.